This is Paul Fam Famojuro from the Tank Museum in the UK, which houses the biggest collection of tanks in the world. Today, he's joining us to break down just a few tanks and tank scenes from across video games.
You would never want to get outside of your tank whilst it's under fire to make repairs. The crew is just far safer just staying where they are.
If you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to let us know in the comment section below and subscribe for more. For more on the Tank Museum, there will be links in the description for information on how to visit, as well as their YouTube channel featuring a plethora of real-world tank breakdowns. Without further ado, let's join Fam in the tank.
That appears to be a Mark V tank. Now, if this is towards the end of the First World War, it's most likely going to be a Mark V. The Mark V was the next generation of First World War tank after the Mark IV. Biggest differences were it had an engine designed specifically to work in a tank. Now, the earlier tanks, or the Mark IVs and so on that came before, the engines in those basically were just taken out of a bus, and because of the way they were designed, they essentially needed 4 members of the crew to essentially steer a tank. The Mark V made it so that the driver literally was just driving the tank. The Mark IVs were a lot more complicated. Through Mud and Blood, I know that this is probably one of the more popular campaigns in Battlefield 1, but it's definitely worth mentioning what Through Mud and Blood means. So there was a general called General Hugh Ellis, and he was the guy who essentially led the attack at Cambrai. And Through Mud and Blood actually comes from the phrase he used, which was through mud and blood onto the green fields and beyond. And what that also represents is the Royal Tank Regiment flag. If you ever look at the Royal Tank Regiment flag, you've got 3 colours. You've got brown at the bottom, which represents the mud. You've got red in the middle, which represents the blood. And you then have the green at the top, representing the green fields and beyond. So really nice choice of title for this campaign. A lot of people ask what is the point of a tank, or why did the tank come to be in the first place? And obviously the tank originates from the First World War, British invention, and ultimately it was designed to cross the trenches but also to get through the horrific scenes of no man's land. You're looking at huge amounts of mud, barbed wire, and ultimately you're looking at hundreds of thousands of deaths and essentially no progress really being made. So a big stalemate there, and the question was, how do we break that stalemate? And ultimately, the hardest thing to get through really was the barbed wire. What the artillery used to do is basically just bring down loads of artillery on top of barbed wire to try and break it apart. All it really did was make it worse and kind of bunch all together, giving the infantry an even harder time getting through it. So ultimately they needed something to ultimately get across the trenches, but also to get across the barbed wire and break it open. And that essentially is where the tank comes into play.
I'll pluck every feather off that damn... Easy there, that pigeon could save your life. It's our only line of communication.
Complaining about the pigeon, you would not want to lay a finger on that pigeon. I know we're talking about tanks, but it's worth mentioning the pigeons as well. So the pigeon played a real key part in the First World War. Tanks didn't have radios in the First World War, at least most tanks didn't have them, because they were so big at the time that if you wanted to put in a set of radios, you're probably going to have to get rid of your armament, your guns. Tanks were given carrier pigeons, and they were used as a form of communication with the outside world, so to speak. And they, believe it or not, were actually really effective. They say that the use of the carrier pigeon in the First World War was about 95% success rate. And because the pigeons were essentially doing their job as well in the First World War alongside the soldiers, they were also seen as serving. So if you actually did anything to a pigeon or injured it or killed it, you're pretty much going to be looking at a court-martialing. So yeah, the guy in the tank here is definitely not going to be putting a finger on a pigeon.
See that tank, Edwards? Don't get us stuck in the mud like that.
As he pointed out, yeah, don't get stuck in the mud like that. As much as tanks can go through mud, and ultimately, because they're tracked vehicles, they have a bit of a better time getting across rough terrain, mud is still the enemy of the tank, whether it be in the First World War or even today. Obviously, more modern tanks are much more capable, but even back then, yeah, mud was a very easy way to get stuck in a tank, and if you got stuck, then that's basically it. You're going to be a sitting duck, and then it's pretty much game over. Yeah, thing to remember as well with these First World War tanks, they're basically designed to be bulletproof, but if you come up against artillery or a field gun, that's pretty much going to go straight through wherever you're aiming on one of these tanks. These only have about 14 millimeters of armor max, which is about that thin, so not a huge amount of armor at all. So making good use of the variety of armament on these tanks. Believe it or not, there's different types of tanks. So although we're looking at a Mark V, this is a Mark V male tank, and what that means is, although it does have machine guns in places, the sponsons, the big boxes on the side of the tank, the main armament there are the 6-pounder guns, which are much bigger, slower firing. You have female tanks as well, which only have machine guns, and the male tanks were pretty effective at knocking out like 4 or 5 positions, but with female tanks, they were very much good at just taking out infantry also on the move. Like, these tanks don't have any suspension at all. So if you want your 6-pounder gunner to get a hit, you're stopping your tank. There's no way you're really going to get a reliable chance of hitting a target on the move. The life of a tank crew is really, really harsh. Very uncomfortable, very, very noisy. The whole crew is literally surrounded around the engine. Once that thing is running, it's very hard to hear your own crewmates. You're literally going to have to be shouting over each other just to be able to hear. The inside of these tanks could reach up to 50 degrees Celsius, which is very, very hot. Yeah, huge respect for the people who served in the First World War tanks especially. It was a very new invention. Not a whole lot had been tested about them. You get a lot of people that are like, oh, yeah, there's a lot of inaccuracies in this game and stuff like that, but you got to give credit to the developers of Battlefield 1. They very much went over the top to try and get that accuracy, and to, I'm not saying it's 100% accurate, but to give players that authentic experience. It's just very well done. Anyone who likes tanks will probably recognise that. That is the L333 Carro Veloce. That is a little Italian tankette, they call them tankette because they're so small. That is smaller than, say, a very small hatchback. Looking at a crew of 2 in that, looking at a driver and a commander/gunner. Yeah, very interesting vehicle. It's kind of become a bit of a meme nowadays, especially with different video games like War Thunder, what we're seeing here. It's definitely an interesting vehicle. They entered service just before the Second World War. They were used in the Italo-Ethiopian War, where they basically were designed to just take on like infantry and stuff like that. They definitely weren't designed to take on armor. Although with this particular variant here, we're looking at what looks to be an anti-tank rifle, or at least an anti-material rifle. One thing with the L333 Carro Veloce was that because of how small they were, and they were actually genuinely quite fast, they made to be quite difficult targets to hit at times when they did eventually go up against other armor. But in terms of armor protection though, like, you're not looking at much at all. We do have one of these in our collection. Ours is the L335, which is a slightly upgraded version of it with a bit more armor protection. But our particular one is, I always like to describe it as a spicy variant because it's actually a flamethrowing tank. So it looks exactly like this, but has a really weird looking flamethrower nozzle at the front. And then at the back, it's towing a little trailer full of essentially what is napalm. They did see use actually in the Spanish Civil War, where they ended up being used against a couple of Soviet tanks like the T-26 and the BT-5 series. Alright, so we've now got World of Tanks, and that is a very, very familiar tank. That is Tiger 131. So obviously I'm here at the Tank Museum, and one of the most famous tanks in our collection is Tiger 131, which was the first Tiger that was knocked out and captured by the British during the Second World War. The first that was captured mostly intact and in functioning condition. It was actually captured in Tunisia in 1943. It was the first example of a fully functioning captured German tank. Because it was such a infamous vehicle at the time, so basically if they needed to abandon the vehicles, that they had to destroy it so that the Allies couldn't capture or use them. Tiger 1, so when it entered service, it was pretty much the best thing out there. It had that colossal 88mm gun, which could smash through pretty much anything the Allies had at the time. The most heavily armoured tank that the British really had was the Churchill. Even with the first early versions, you're looking just over 100mm of armour, but the 88mm on that Tiger is going to go straight through that anyway. So it doesn't do great for morale when you know that if you were a Churchill tank crewman and you knew that despite being in the most heavily armoured British tank of the time, if you came up against that 88mm gun or the Tiger, your chances of survival were pretty slim. But yeah, no, it's really, really cool to see what essentially is our tank in a video game, and so well represented as well. What they essentially did is they 3D scanned a ridiculous amount of our vehicles. They put these little white dots all over them and basically scanned the whole vehicle in it, essentially. If you actually sometimes go around, we still sometimes find the little white dots. Yeah, all that detail is there, especially at the back there. That right exhaust cover is very black with all the fumes that come out, and again, our actual one is exactly like that. Also, a lot of small arms fire at the back as well. You've got bullet holes that a section of infantry did to when they were attacking it. I mean, we do make a huge deal out of Tiger 131. There are a couple of Tiger 1s that are running, but a lot of these aren't using like original running gear or engines and stuff like that. Some are running on diesels, but we pride ourselves here on the fact that we have the only running Tiger 1 that is running a genuine, authentic Maybach engine. It's running a HL230, which is actually the more upgraded engine compared to what they would have had when they first entered service. And we have events like Tiger Day where we take it out on our arena for admirers to watch it drive around. Ah, this looks like Warhammer 40k. I believe this tank is called the Leman Russ. Straight off the bat, I'm just looking at it and I'm thinking that's got a huge amount of inspiration from the First World War tanks that the British used, which we saw at the beginning of this with Battlefield 1. Although kind of on steroids. Big turret at the top. You've still got the sponsons either side there. Big plow, big spade at the front there as well. And we'll say, tanks do use spades. They do have big dozer blades at the front. A lot of the times to dig themselves into more fortified positions and get hull down. I have a feeling it might not be used like that in this though. You know, I say it's akin to that of the First World War tanks, like the Mark IVs or Mark Vs. There's actually another tank called the International, which was a kind of a joint operation between the Americans and the British. And essentially, it's a bit like a Mark V tank with those sponsons at the side. The idea was that if you were going to take on, or if you were going to be going up against multiple targets, it's not very useful when you only have one gun, which can only face in one direction at any one time. So that's when you end up getting stuff like this. And I know it's a game, but it's inspired by features on real tanks, you know, just guns all over the place, machine guns for like infantry, bigger guns for fortifications and stuff like that. Ah, that is interesting. So we've got, I don't know if that is that a tank? We've got a tank on the left there, big red one with a kind of like a rolling pin at the front there. That is interesting. So at the front there, you've got that big spiky roller, and it looks like there's probably lots of blood on it, so presumably in Warhammer it's used to squash all the infantry or something like that. I will say there is a brilliant example of a tank in real life that actually has a rolling pin kind of like that, and that is the Sherman Crab. The Sherman Crab was essentially a heavily modified version of the Sherman to incorporate what is a bit like a washing machine drum at the front that spins really fast. But instead of spikes, you would have lots of heavy chains that hang down from it. It is used to basically take out mines. Now, obviously, mines were a huge problem, not just for infantry, but especially for armoured vehicles like tanks during the Second World War, and even nowadays, to be fair. Essentially, what it was just a mine flayer. It was designed to just spin up. You'd have those really heavy chains that would be smashing, pummeling into the ground, basically driving forward and clearing a path for all the other armoured vehicles that would be following behind. We've got a different tank now. We've got the Baneblade. That is interesting. Again, you've got multiple guns. You've still got those sponsons at the side there, but you've also got, is that 1, 2, 3 turrets at the top? And you've got smaller turrets, and you've got that one big turret at the top in the centre. The first thing that comes to mind when I look at that is this concept vehicle that the Germans considered making in the Second World War, called the P1000 Rat. It was literally a fortress on tracks. This thing weighed 1,000 tons. It basically incorporated a turret from one of the German battleships or the cruisers at the time. So this thing is literally like stories high. It's absolutely colossal. If you just look at the thing, it's just absolutely insane. It does look like something you would expect from Warhammer. So they've done a good job illustrating just wacky tank design like that. I recognise that tank, and I recognise this game. We're looking at Helldivers 2. When I came up against a tank in this game for the first time, and immediately I pretty much just felt helpless because I was not prepared for it. And I've got to say, the tank design in Helldivers is pretty good. It's pretty good. We have what appears to be turret with 4 I'd say machine guns, like laser guns in it, laser cannons. That reminds me of a rather peculiar vehicle from the Second World War called the Skink. A bit of a weird name, but essentially what it was a Canadian version of a Sherman, which the Canadians called a Grizzly. And instead of like your 75mm main gun, they put 4 20mm machine guns and a fully armored turret. It was designed to take out aircraft. Quite a few examples of that actually in the Second World War and briefly after as well, of just tanks that are basically converted for anti-aircraft use. Although in this case they're using it against infantry, which makes it about 10 times more terrifying. Oh yeah, here's the obvious weak point at the back of the tank. Although in all fairness, the back of the tank is usually the weakest part of it. Well, actually I say that, the top is usually the weakest, but most of the time you're not shooting down from the top. Although in recent years, there are weapons like the Javelin, which have been in existence for a while now, which utilizes and takes advantage of the weak point of a tank at the top by just launching a missile, goes all the way up and then comes straight down on that weak armor. I feel like games like this, although they're not necessarily always trying to be like accurate or like realistic per se, but like they do a really, really great job of like illustrating how tanks can be kind of like formidable on the battlefield and like make you feel like helpless. I mean, at least with Helldivers, you've got the kind of kit that you can use against tanks, provided you prepare for it. All right, we're now looking at Squad. Have played this, not played a huge amount of it. In fact, when I played it, they didn't actually have tanks in it, so this will be interesting to watch. I'm a bit out the loop when it comes to tanks in this. Pretty cool, actually. So what we're looking at here is like models that show different weaknesses of different vehicles in game. Do you use that in real life? Vehicle recognition models, we've actually got quite a big collection of them. And there we go, we have a Challenger 2, regarded as one of the best main battle tanks in the world. What you're looking at essentially is kind of similar to what you would have expected to see when the Challenger 2 was used in theatres or in like, conflicts like the Iraq War in 2003. Got the thermal observation gunnery system just above the main gun at the front there. Gives the gunner and the commander the ability to see at night, night vision, thermal vision. Anyone wondering what those vent-looking things are on the side of the turret are basically there to help fellow crews identify each other, so to speak. So what happens is if you look at a tank through thermal vision, you're going to see the heat map and stuff like that. And what those grid-looking things will do is it's coated in a certain substance that reduces the heat signature on thermal vision, so that if you were looking at a Challenger 2 through thermal vision, it's going to be a bit obvious that what you're looking at is a friendly tank. Fun fact, those eyes are actually a thing that are on some of the real tanks. It kind of pays homage to some of the first tanks that were used, because they actually had the same eyes painted on them. And to be fair, throughout history, especially with British tanks, you do tend to see those little eyes painted on the side of the turrets. There we go, big damage on that enemy tank just there. And from what we're looking at, if we can read correctly on the bottom right, we're looking at Charm, which is a type of ammunition that is used by the British with Challenger 2. Basically, it's an armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot round. It's designed to have a lot of drag so that when it leaves the barrel, it gets ripped off, and then you've just got a big dart traveling at roughly about 1 mile per second. They go insanely fast. So if you want to get around quickly, I'd say take a fin-stabilized round. Obviously, it's not necessarily trying to be real, and I'm not going to criticize too much because it is a game at the end of the day. But you would never want to get outside of your tank whilst it's under fire to make repairs. At least not in like more modern main battle tanks. The crew is just far safer just staying where they are. There are actually some pretty good examples of that with the Challenger 2. When it was used in Iraq in 2003, there were multiple cases where they came under a huge amount of enemy fire. One Challenger 2 survived 14 hits by RPGs, but there was another one, which I think happened in Basra, where a Challenger 2 basically got stuck. And this Challenger 2 was hit by anti-tank guided missiles and roughly 70 RPGs. The crew did survive, and they did manage to recover the tank, and after a bit of work, it was put back in service. Really demonstrated the effectiveness of the Challenger 2's protection, unlike in this example here. But again, if you're getting a bomb dropped on you, you're not in a great situation there, especially if you're in a tank. I mean, we can see that what is presumably a Soviet vehicle because that is a turret going into orbit. A lot of people have seen like actual footage of this happening, especially in recent years. So with a lot of the Soviet vehicles, you're looking at stuff like the T-72, T-80s. None of those tanks have loaders inside them. They use an auto-loading system. What you have essentially is on the floor of the turret is something called a carousel, where you have a piece of ammunition, your projectile, and your bag charge, and essentially this mechanical arm will basically shove that ammunition into the breech. You can reload quite quick, but if anything goes wrong with your autoloader, then you basically go from being a tank to an armoured vehicle. If you're being shot at, then you're not an armoured vehicle for much longer. But it did mean that if the ammunition was hit, literally all that pressure is coming from right below the turret. So pop, you get that turret going up into the air. So again, well illustrated with squad here. Those targets are very, very, very far away, but that is not a problem for a Challenger 2 or even earlier tanks like the Challenger 1, to be fair. The Challenger 1 held the record for the longest tank-on-tank kill in history, which was during the Gulf War. Knocked out an enemy tank at roughly 5.2 kilometers, about that range. Really, really long distance. That's about 3.2, 3.1 miles. Right, on to our final game now, and I believe this is Gunner Heat PC. I have not played this. I really want to play it because it looks really, really cool. It's almost like a bit like a tank sim, but they seem to focus a bit more on like immersion, I guess. So straight off the bat, one thing that really stands out with Gunner Heat PC is the way that they sort of recreate the crew, so to speak. The communications, to be specific. At the end of the day, when you're talking about tank crews, you're on about 3 or 4 people all communicating with each other, particularly the commander with the loader and the gunner. And most games don't really illustrate that. It looks like we're using an M1 Abrams here. I think this is possibly the first version of it. It looks like a 105mm gun, so that would be the first iteration of it. The more modern M1 Abrams is using 120mm smoothbore. Yeah, really, really good attention to detail when it comes to the crew communication. You're essentially listening to the commander give a firing order, and that is a lot of information in a very, very short amount of time. So, Gunner, Heat, PC, what does that mean? Gunner, basically, be ready. Heat is the type of ammunition that is going to be loaded into that gun, but also it means that the gunner knows that they can make any adjustments on their sights, that they know exactly what ammunition that they're using. PC, in this case, means personnel carrier. Really, really great name for the game though, like Gunner Heat PC. It's a PC game, but it literally is, the name of the game is literally a firing order. And even the panic of the crews as they're being engaged by other targets. I mean, you know, as I mentioned earlier, like being a tank crew is it's very intense. I've not ex-forces myself, but from the veterans we talk to, whether they be veterans from the Second World War or in more recent conflicts, you know, it's incredibly intense, and you're relying on the people around you to make sure that you can get through in one piece. And yeah, no, Gunner Heat does a great example of like illustrating communications between the crews and also the emotions as well. Definitely adds a bit of say, not necessarily realism, it adds a huge amount of immersion, I would say. I would definitely enjoy playing this at some point. Right, so we've looked at 5 different games, focusing on the tanks that are being featured in them. And as a gamer and as someone who is a huge tank enthusiast and works at a tank museum, really, really, really cool, because it's just great to see not just attention to detail when it comes to like different tanks and games, but also when it comes to like more fantasy or like science fiction based ones like Helldivers or Warhammer, just to see how like some of the tanks in them have like inspiration and influence from actual real world examples. But yeah, no, it's really, really cool to look at the different types of tanks that are used in video games. So yeah.